On April 17, 1943, Captain Robert B. Westbrook had already been in combat for months before the engagement that would define his record. The 8th Fighter Group had been operating from the rough airstrips of Guadalcanal since early in the campaign, rotating aircraft, pilots, and maintenance crews through a rhythm dictated by weather and Japanese reconnaissance patterns. By April, the great naval clashes of 1942 were past, but the air war had not diminished. It had shifted into a campaign of sustained pressure, daily reconnaissance, periodic bomber sweeps, and fighter escorts probing Allied expansion northward. Westbrook's squadron, the 35th Fighter Squadron, flew the Curtiss P-40K and P-40M variants. The Allison V1710 engine, liquid-cooled and reliable at medium altitude, lacked a 2-stage supercharger. That deficiency was known to every pilot in the group. Japanese formations often attempted to exploit altitude, descending from 20,000 feet or higher with gravity in their favor. American pilots responded by using radar cues and coastwatcher reports to position themselves before visual contact. That morning began with routine engine checks under a pale sky. The field's pierced steel planking radiated heat. Ground crews inspected coolant lines and ammunition feeds. Each P-40 carried 6 Browning AN/M2.50 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, typically loaded with a mix of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds. Ammunition allotment allowed approximately 15 seconds of continuous fire. Pilots were trained to fire in short, disciplined bursts, 1 to 2 seconds, to conserve ammunition and prevent overheating. At 0955 local time, the operations shack received confirmation from coastwatchers north of New Georgia. A large Japanese formation had departed Rabaul, moving southeast. Estimates suggested bombers escorted by numerous fighters. The Solomons Air Campaign revolved around these arcs from Rabaul, the principal Japanese base in the theater. Distance from Rabaul to Guadalcanal exceeded 500 miles. That range imposed fuel limitations on Japanese aircraft, constraining loiter time and forcing precise navigation. Westbrook was airborne shortly after the scramble order. His P-40 climbed steadily at approximately 2,000 feet per minute in the initial phase, though that rate diminished with altitude and tropical density. The cockpit was narrow and hot. Engine instruments required constant monitoring. Coolant temperature could spike during sustained climbs. He leveled briefly at 12,000 feet to build speed, then resumed climbing toward 18,000. Radio transmissions were clipped, functional. Other American fighters were either too distant or committed elsewhere. Westbrook understood that interception geometry would depend on his own timing. If he arrived too low, he would be forced to climb through escorting zeros. Too high, and the engine would struggle for power during maneuvering. By 10:28, he had visual contact. The Japanese formation was arranged in layered echelons. Mitsubishi G4M Betty twin-engine bombers formed the core, flying in tight defensive groupings designed to maximize overlapping fields of defensive fire. Above and to the flanks, Mitsubishi A6M Zeros executed weaving patrols, scanning for attackers. Total count, later assessed, reached 64 aircraft. Westbrook was alone within immediate engagement range. He did not attempt to climb above the highest escorts. Instead, he positioned himself offset, using the sun angle to obscure his approach. The Pacific sun, nearly overhead, created glare across canopy glass and polished metal surfaces. He rolled into a diving attack aimed at the trailing edge of the bomber formation. His objective was not to eliminate the entire strike force, it was to impose disorder. The first pass damaged a bomber's port engine. Flames trailed briefly before the fire was extinguished by slipstream. The aircraft fell behind formation, losing altitude. Escorting Zeros reacted as predicted, several peeled downward to pursue the attacker. Westbrook extended in a shallow dive to increase separation. The P-40's structural integrity allowed high-speed dives beyond 400 miles per hour indicated airspeed. The Zero, though highly maneuverable, lacked similar dive tolerance and could experience control stiffening at extreme speeds. By forcing the engagement downward, he exploited that disparity. At 8,000 feet, he leveled and reversed, climbing back toward the bombers from a different heading. The sky was now fragmented. Zeros were dispersed in altitude, some chasing him, others returning to escort positions. The bomber formation had compressed slightly under the stress of maneuvering. His second attack targeted the lead element. A head-on approach reduced exposure time to defensive fire, but required precise timing. Closure speed was extreme. At approximately 400 yards, he fired a concentrated burst. Strikes impacted the cockpit and nose section of a G4M. Smoke issued from the aircraft and it veered out of line. Defensive fire intensified. Tracers crossed his flight path. One round struck the underside of his left wing. The impact was audible even through engine noise. The P-40 remained controllable. The Japanese formation began defensive adjustments. Bombers altered altitude incrementally, attempting to create a more cohesive defensive perimeter. But each alteration required coordination. Westbrook's continued presence forced reactive rather than planned movement. He made a third diving pass, this time angling across the formation to maximize disruption. His ammunition counters were diminishing. He avoided extended chases of individual aircraft. The priority remained the bomber stream. As he broke away from that pass, at least 4 Zeros converged. One closed within 200 yards and fired. Tracers passed over his canopy. Westbrook initiated a diving spiral, maintaining speed while denying a stable firing solution. The Zero pilots attempted to cut inside his turn, but the increasing speed reduced their advantage. The engagement had now lasted over 15 minutes. Japanese bombers were approaching their designated release line over Guadalcanal's northern approaches. Anti-aircraft batteries below began tracking the formation. Westbrook climbed for one final attack before fuel constraints would force disengagement. He approached from slightly above the bomber altitude and selected a target near the center of the formation. At 300 yards, he fired in a controlled 2-second burst. The bomber's starboard engine erupted in flame. The aircraft rolled and began descending, losing structural integrity as it fell. Moments later, bomb loads were released. Observers on the ground later reported that the pattern was scattered and imprecise. Some bombs fell short into open water. Others detonated in jungle without significant effect. The concentrated damage intended by the strike had been mitigated. Additional American fighters finally entered the engagement zone, having climbed from other fields. Their arrival further dispersed the Japanese escorts. The strike package, low on fuel after the long transit from Rabaul, began withdrawing northward. Westbrook checked his gauges. Fuel was below optimal reserve. Ammunition was nearly expended. Oil streaked along his canopy from earlier hits. He descended toward Guadalcanal. Landing procedures were routine but precise. The P-40's landing speed approached 90 miles per hour. The pierced steel planking runway demanded alignment. Crosswinds could create lateral drift. He touched down cleanly and taxied to revetment. Post-mission debriefing was structured and unemotional. Claims were recorded based on pilot observation and corroborating reports. Later analysis would adjust numbers, as was common in the fog of air combat. What remained clear was that one aircraft had engaged a formation of 64 and forced it into defensive fragmentation. Within 3 weeks, on May 5, 1943, Captain Westbrook would be killed in action during another interception over the Solomons. His Medal of Honor citation described repeated attacks against superior numbers and the disruption of enemy bombing effectiveness. The award recognized not spectacle, but sustained tactical aggression under extreme imbalance. The broader air campaign continued. Allied forces advanced up the Solomons chain. Japanese aviation losses accumulated. The attritional mathematics favored American industrial capacity and pilot training throughput. By late 1943, control of the air in that sector had shifted decisively. In early April 1943, the 8th Fighter Group operated at a tempo that left little margin for rest. The airstrips at Guadalcanal were functional but primitive. Steel matting covered uneven coral. Drainage was imperfect. Afternoon rain squalls could turn adjacent ground into mud that swallowed tools and boots alike. Aircraft maintenance was constant. Salt air corroded metal surfaces. Engine filters required frequent cleaning to prevent abrasive coral dust from degrading cylinder walls. Captain Robert B. Westbrook had arrived in the South Pacific after stateside training that emphasized formation discipline and gunnery accuracy. Combat in the Solomons refined those lessons under pressure. Engagements were often sudden. Visual detection preceded radar integration in many cases. Pilots relied on coast watchers stationed on remote islands, Australian and Solomon Islander observers who transmitted coded warnings of approaching aircraft. Minutes separated warning from contact. Japanese doctrine in the region drew heavily from pre-war naval aviation experience. Strike packages launched from Rabaul typically consisted of Mitsubishi G4M bombers escorted by Mitsubishi A6M fighters. The G4M possessed long range but lacked armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks in early variants. Its design prioritized range over survivability. In formation, however, concentrated defensive fire could deter careless attackers. Escorting Zeros were tasked with maintaining altitude advantage and intercepting Allied fighters before they reached bomber positions. By mid-April, American forces were extending their perimeter northward. Airfields at Guadalcanal supported operations toward New Georgia and the Central Solomons. Japanese planners sought to disrupt this expansion through concentrated strikes. The April 17 mission was one of several large-scale efforts to reassert pressure. Westbrook's prior combat record established him as aggressive but methodical. He did not pursue engagements for spectacle. Squadron mates described him as deliberate in pre-flight checks, attentive to engine readings, and conservative with ammunition. In the Pacific theater, logistical strain meant replacement aircraft were not guaranteed. Survival required both courage and mechanical sympathy. On the morning of April 17, weather conditions were marginally favorable for high-altitude visibility. Cloud layers were scattered between 10,000 and 15,000 feet, with clearer air above. Surface winds were light from the southeast. Visibility extended for miles over open water. When Coast Watcher reports indicated a large inbound formation, operations officers calculated projected interception points based on estimated speed and heading. Japanese bombers typically cruised between 200 and 250 miles per hour. Escorts could vary speed, but were constrained by the need to remain cohesive. Westbrook's climb profile aimed to intercept ahead of the formation's projected track rather than chasing from behind. As he ascended past 15,000 feet, the P-40's climb rate diminished. The Allison engine's single-stage supercharger limited power at altitude. He adjusted mixture and propeller pitch to maintain optimal performance. Engine coolant temperature edged toward upper limits, but remained within tolerance. At approximately 10:28 local time, sunlight reflected off metal surfaces ahead. Through canopy glass, the formation appeared first as scattered glints, then as defined silhouettes. Westbrook counted layers: bombers center mass, fighters above in loose weave, additional elements trailing slightly behind. He assessed distance. At current closure rate, contact would occur within 2 minutes. There was no immediate friendly formation within supporting range. He positioned above the bomber stream but offset laterally to avoid silhouetting himself against the sky directly above them. The sun angle provided partial concealment. Japanese pilots scanning upward would contend with glare. His first dive began from roughly 18,000 feet. He rolled inverted to reduce structural stress during entry, then pushed forward. Airspeed increased rapidly past 300 miles per hour. The bomber formation expanded in his gun sight. He selected a trailing G4M positioned slightly outside the densest defensive crossfire. At approximately 350 yards, he fired a controlled burst. Tracers converged on the bomber's left engine nacelle. Smoke emerged, thin at first, then thicker. He held fire no longer than 2 seconds. Ammunition conservation was essential.
He passed beneath the bomber formation and continued downward to increase separation. Zeros reacted. Several escorts broke formation and dove in pursuit. This reaction was anticipated. Every escort committed to chase reduced the protective envelope around the bombers.
Westbrook leveled near 9,000 feet and extended eastward, drawing at least 3 Zeros behind him. He avoided turning tightly. Instead, he maintained speed. The P-40's rugged construction allowed high-speed maneuvering that risked structural failure in lighter aircraft. At 400 miles per hour, he initiated a shallow climbing turn, forcing pursuers to choose between overspeed risk or abandoning chase. 2 Zeros continued briefly before breaking off. He climbed again, angling toward the bomber formation from a new direction. The Japanese formation had adjusted slightly, compressing to tighten defensive arcs. Bombers edged closer, reducing gaps. This compression increased risk for attackers, but also reduced maneuvering flexibility within the formation. Westbrook chose a head-on pass. Head-on attacks required precise timing and nerve. Closure speed could exceed 500 miles per hour combined. Firing window was less than 2 seconds. Defensive gunners in the bomber's nose had minimal time to react. He aligned on the lead bomber of a central element. At approximately 400 yards, he began firing short bursts to correct aim. At 250 yards, he committed to a 1-second concentrated burst aimed at cockpit and forward fuselage. He passed within tens of yards of the bomber. The aircraft emitted smoke and began descending slightly out of alignment. Defensive tracers streaked past his canopy. A round struck the underside of his right wing, audible as a metallic crack. Control surfaces responded normally. He rolled hard left and descended again. Time from initial contact to this second pass was under 5 minutes. Below, Guadalcanal's coastline was visible through breaks in cloud. Anti-aircraft batteries were preparing. Ground observers tracked the formation. Radio traffic increased, though Westbrook's own transmissions were minimal. Radio silence preserved clarity. Zeros reformed above the bombers. This time, they attempted to anticipate his climb and position for interception at altitude. Westbrook adjusted by approaching from slightly below and to the side, using cloud fragments as partial concealment. He climbed only enough to align with bomber altitude before diving through again. The third pass struck a bomber mid-formation. He aimed at the wing root, a structural vulnerability. His burst ignited fuel vapor. Flames trailed briefly before slipstream intensified the fire. The bomber fell away, descending in a shallow spiral. Escort coordination now degraded. Zeros were scattered at varying altitudes, some chasing, others regrouping. The bomber formation began minor altitude changes to compensate. These adjustments disrupted precise bomb release timing. At approximately 10:40, bombers reached release distance. Westbrook executed one final approach, this time angled across the formation to maximize psychological and tactical disruption rather than focusing on a single target. He fired brief bursts into 2 separate aircraft during the pass. One trailed smoke, the other broke formation abruptly. Moments later, bombs fell. Post-engagement analysis indicated that the bombing pattern was dispersed, lacking concentrated impact typical of undisturbed formations. Some ordnance fell into jungle canopy without significant infrastructure damage. The disruption achieved by repeated attacks had forced early release and degraded aim. American reinforcements arrived minutes later, climbing into contact. Japanese aircraft, low on fuel after the long flight from Rabaul, began withdrawal northward. The engagement diffused into scattered skirmishes before dissolving entirely. Westbrook checked fuel. Remaining reserve was limited. He descended toward Guadalcanal at moderate power to conserve engine strain. Oil streaks along his canopy suggested minor penetration but no catastrophic damage. He landed at approximately 10:55. Debrief reports were clinical. Time of contact, number of passes, estimated enemy strength, ammunition expenditure, observed damage, confirmation of kills required corroboration. Fog of combat often inflated initial claims. Later cross-checking reduced totals. Regardless of final count, the operational effect was acknowledged. A single fighter had forced a large strike to defend rather than attack cohesively. On May 5, 1943, less than 2 weeks later, Westbrook engaged another Japanese formation and was shot down during a low-level attack on enemy aircraft. His body was not recovered. He was 27 years old.
The Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously, cited his April 17 action, among others, emphasizing repeated attacks against superior numbers and the prevention of effective bombing. The broader campaign in the Solomon Islands moved steadily north. Allied airfields multiplied. Japanese long-range strike capacity diminished under attrition. The mathematics of industrial production and pilot replacement began to dominate the theater.
By early 1943, the struggle for air superiority in the South Pacific had shifted from desperate defense to calculated expansion. The battle for Guadalcanal had ended months earlier, but its consequences were unfolding daily. Henderson Field, once barely operational, had become the anchor of an advancing Allied air network. The strategic objective was simple in concept, difficult in execution. Isolate and neutralize Rabaul, Japan's principal fortress in the Southwest Pacific. Rabaul was not merely an airfield, it was a naval base, supply hub, and operational nerve center. From there, Japanese forces could dispatch bombers and fighters to strike Allied shipping, troop concentrations, and forward airstrips. The distance from Rabaul to Guadalcanal was long, roughly 565 miles one way, but within reach of Mitsubishi G4M bombers. That range allowed Japan to contest Allied expansion long after losing physical control of the island. The Allied response evolved into what would later be formalized as Operation Cartwheel, a multi-pronged effort to encircle and isolate Rabaul without launching a costly direct assault. Air power was the central instrument of that strategy. Japanese strike planning from Rabaul. Japanese air operations in the Solomons relied heavily on established naval aviation doctrine. Strike packages typically formed in stages. Bombers assembled first. Fighter escorts climbed to protective altitude. Final coordination occurred before crossing the coast. From Rabaul's airfields, Lakunai, Vunakanau, and others, G4M Betty bombers would launch in waves. Their crews depended on precise fuel calculations. The round trip to Guadalcanal required careful throttle management. There was little margin for prolonged dogfighting. Escort fighters, primarily the Mitsubishi A6M0, carried external drop tanks for range. Once combat began, those tanks were often jettisoned to improve maneuverability. But jettisoning reduced fuel endurance dramatically. This meant Japanese fighter commanders faced constant trade-offs. Stay tightly with bombers and conserve fuel, brake aggressively to pursue interceptors, and risk running short on the return flight. The April 17 formation, approximately 60-plus aircraft, represented a major commitment. Such concentration was not routine. It signaled intent to inflict meaningful disruption on Guadalcanal's growing air capacity. But scale introduced vulnerability. Large formations required strict coordination. Any disruption, especially from high-speed diving attacks, forced escorts into reactive posture. Once escort fighters began chasing, bomber cohesion weakened. That vulnerability was exactly what Westbrook exploited. The aircraft, P-40 versus A6M0. Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. The P-40 was not the fastest Allied fighter of the war, nor the highest climbing, but it possessed key advantages in the Pacific: rugged construction, heavier armament, typically 6.50 caliber machine guns, strong diving capability, better survivability due to armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Its Allison V1710 engine, however, used a single-stage supercharger. Above 15,000 to 18,000 feet, performance degraded noticeably compared to aircraft with multi-stage superchargers. The P-40's strength was energy fighting, maintaining speed, attacking in diving passes, and avoiding slow-turning engagements. Mitsubishi A6M0. The A6M emphasized exceptional maneuverability, long range, lightweight, superior climb at low to medium altitude. However, this performance came at a cost. Minimal pilot armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks in early variants, structural limits at high dive speeds. At high velocity, the Zero risked control stiffening or structural damage. In steep dives above roughly 400 miles per hour, its airframe could become difficult to manage. Westbrook's April 17 action illustrates a classic tactical principle: energy fighting versus turning fighting. If he had attempted to dogfight Zeros in sustained turning combat, the outcome would likely have been fatal. The Zero could outturn a P-40 decisively at most speeds. Instead, Westbrook used altitude as stored energy. Altitude equals potential energy. Speed equals kinetic energy.
Each dive converted altitude into speed. Each extension converted speed into separation. Each climb recharged altitude for another attack. This method minimized exposure time, forced escorts into reactive dives, reduced ammunition waste, preserved structural integrity. The key was discipline. Many pilots succumbed to instinct and entered turning duels. Westbrook did not. Psychological disruption. Beyond mechanical advantage, repeated diving attacks created psychological strain inside bomber formations. Imagine the cockpit of a G4M, vibrating airframe, reports over intercom of fighters above, sudden impact of .50 caliber rounds, smoke entering fuselage, escorts peeling away unpredictably. Each pass forced crews to anticipate impact. Even if only a few bombers were severely damaged, the perception of vulnerability rippled through the formation. Tightened formations improved defensive arcs, but increased collision risk and complicated precise bomb aiming. The result on April 17th was dispersed bombing. That operational effect, bombs scattered rather than concentrated, may have mattered more than confirmed aircraft destroyed. Attrition mathematics. By 1943, Japan faced a structural disadvantage. Pilot training pipelines required time. Combat attrition in the Solomons, combined with earlier carrier battles such as Battle of Midway, had reduced the cadre of highly experienced aviators. Replacement pilots received shorter training cycles. In contrast, American production capacity expanded dramatically. Aircraft output increased, pilot throughput improved, replacement pools grew. Each Japanese bomber or fighter lost over Guadalcanal was not easily replaced, especially experienced crew. Thus, even a single fighter disrupting or destroying multiple aircraft had cumulative strategic value. The broader air war escalates. Throughout mid-1943, Allied forces advanced toward New Georgia and Bougainville. Airfields multiplied. Each new strip reduced distance to Rabaul. By late 1943, heavy bombers such as the B-24 Liberator joined sustained bombardment campaigns against Rabaul's infrastructure. The fortress that once projected power southward became increasingly isolated. Operation Cartwheel succeeded not through a dramatic siege, but through incremental strangulation. Westbrook's final mission. On May 5, 1943, Westbrook attacked Japanese aircraft at low altitude. Low-level combat reduced altitude advantage and increased exposure to both enemy fighters and ground fire. In that engagement, he was shot down. Low-level attacks eliminated the safety margin provided by energy tactics. They required aggression and accepted risk. His loss underscores the razor-thin margin between tactical mastery and fatal vulnerability in Pacific air combat. Tactical lessons from April 17th. The engagement demonstrates enduring air combat principles. Attack the objective, not merely the opponent. Preserve energy, avoid equalizing advantages, force the enemy to react, disrupt formation cohesion to degrade mission effectiveness. Short, disciplined firing passes outperform prolonged exposure. These principles remain embedded in modern air combat doctrine.